Greenhouses, they're amazing. Whether or not you're going to go really small scale, like a tiny little cloche, maybe made out of a recycled bottle or a plastic container, just over your veggie seedlings, or huge scale with, large permanent structures that give you a season extension for really big spaces. They're really valuable either way to try and get the most out of your growing space. In a sense, they extend your area by extending the time that you can grow in. If you've only got a small garden in a place that gets quite cold in winter, you'll know that things really quieten down in that cold part of the year. So anything you can do to grow things faster in the shoulder season will do a lot to increase your productivity. Hi Trish from Perth, welcome. So Perth can get pretty warm. Doesn't get freezing cold there. Whereas if you're right down the southern tip of WA, where you get more frosts, then the design of those two greenhouses is going to be a little bit different. So I'm going to kick straight off and get into some of the questions that have come through. I've got one here from Rebecca. Rebecca has old window frames that she'd like to turn into a cold frame over raised garden beds. She was thinking about an A-frame shape with open ends. Not sure how to construct them though. That's a really good start. An A-frame with open ends is brilliant, because one of the things that people overlook a lot is that need for ventilation. And typically we're going for somewhere between, at minimum, 25% of the area that you're growing needs to be open space. So in the greenhouse. So an A-frame's great because you can leave those big ends opened. So if it was over, let's say, a garden bed that was 4 meters long by 1 meter wide, then we'd want at least a whole square meter of openness at the ends to allow airflow to try and make sure it doesn't get too hot in there. And the same, it's actually a minimum of like 1 square meter total of openness. We'd probably want to be between 1 and 2 square meters of openness for a 4 square meter garden bed. So as far as the structure for that, an A-frame works really well because of that ventilation, but it also means I would be building a solid wooden A-frame, so 2 rectangles, and then a bracing piece at the bottom to join them up, and then hinging the glass from the top so that they can be lifted up and propped up. And be very careful with glass windows. You need to make sure that they're ones which are toughened so they're not going to break. And a glass window can be quite heavy, so you don't want that falling down on the back of your head when you're reaching in there to work on your seedlings. But you are going to need to hinge it up in some way so you can get underneath it to work on it. But great question, Rebecca. I've got another one here from Paraiso Eco Villa. They're looking at intensive growing in their greenhouse, and it's been a focus this autumn to research and look for ways, including building structures inside to go up and to grow more, to redevelop the current beds inside to have more depth, and also split the corridor in the middle to fit a third bed. Any best practice on intensive growing and ideas on what's possible would be awesome. Okay, so it sounds like they've got a quite large permanent structure greenhouse. So as far as trying to go up, we found that rather than using solid trellises in greenhouses, it's often easier to use strings hanging down, and then that way we haven't got so much solid infrastructure up there, just a single beam running over your crop and having then strings to tie up your crop. This works really well with tomatoes, and indeed that twirling motion of twirling the tomatoes around a string means you don't really need clips, you don't really need to tie the tomatoes on there, for example. And in large-scale industrial greenhouses, they actually, as the plant grows up, they start moving that whole beam horizontally to lay all the plants down and keep that growing tip growing up and up and up and up and up and up and up. And sometimes they end up with tomato vines, which are 20 metres long in a 4 metre or 5 metre tall greenhouse. And that way they always keep the tomatoes that are being ready for harvest coming down to the point where they're easy to pick. The tomato tips that are growing and the unripe tomatoes are up really high, and then the part of the vine that's already been picked and stripped is lying down on the ground. And that works really well. So I would really recommend using a sort of soft trellising system. As far as trying to get more beds in there, that's awesome. Yeah, and best practice when intensive growing, again, coming down to airflow. You really need to make sure that you've got plenty of airflow in your greenhouse to get the most productivity out of it. You know, in a closed space, those plants are using up the carbon dioxide that's in there to turn that into plant material, into your fruit and veggies. So they need that airflow to make sure that they don't run out of carbon dioxide and they stop photosynthesizing. Also in the middle of the day, of course, it can get really hot in your glasshouse or your greenhouse. So having that ventilation to make sure that it doesn't overheat, and then at night times we can shut it back down to trap some of that heat in there. Somebody made a point on Instagram that, you know, using all this plastic can be a problem, and totally agree. Wherever possible, we try to use recycled materials, secondhand windows, secondhand glass doors, rather than using new plastic. But the fact of the matter is, glass is really heavy and it can be quite dangerous. So that's where sort of plastic wins out. Unfortunately, plastic doesn't last forever, and you know, it is being consumed as it breaks down with the UV radiation. If you're going to get a plastic film to make a greenhouse work, we really highly recommend that you get a very good quality UV stable plastic that'll last 10 years out in the weather, and put it on a solid frame so that it doesn't tear in the wind. Yeah. Got a question from Vanny of the Wall on Instagram. Just wondering if a shade house will be fine for growing seedlings all year round in Melbourne's climate, and unsure whether to go for a greenhouse or a shade house. Great question, Vanny. So your seedlings aren't going to thrive very well in winter in a shade house. They're going to get really leggy, you know, grow really tall and lose colour because they can't photosynthesize properly in that lower amount of light. Also, a shade house might be a little bit warmer at the coldest part of the day, but it's not going to get any excess heat to create rapid growth in the warmer part of the day. So if you want to try and create a little bit of shade in summer, why not make a greenhouse with a clear skin or glass, and then in summer cover that with a sheet of shade cloth and tie it down well. Then you've got the best of both worlds. You've got that reduced heat and reduced photosynthesis in the hot part of the year, and increased heat and increased photosynthesis in the cooler part of the year. Yeah. Got a question from Jess. What's the best fabric material to use all year round? Well, if you're going to go for plastic, buy a high quality greenhouse skin or a polytunnel skin. Like I said, that'll last a lot longer and give you better performance as well. They're designed to transmit more light and block out less. So give that a go. Hi, Christy, on the chat. A lot of this stuff that we've learned about greenhouses really goes back to what the French were doing in Paris at the turn of last century. This is a great little book from 1913, The Intensive Culture of Vegetables. And this outlines a whole bunch of different things that people were doing in Paris around the early 1900s, including how to make frames. And here it is. The basis of the French garden is the frame. It is made to hold 3 lights. So those lights are lightweight window glasses. Here's a light for the frame. Now in those days they had to use small pieces of glass held together with wooden strips between them. Nowadays we can get much larger toughened glass, which is much safer to use. So that was all about extending the season over the winter in Paris, when obviously they get snow there, at a small scale. Not a huge investment, just some bits of wood and some scrap pieces of glass. Now, the master of really taking those French intensive techniques into the modern era is a guy called Elliot Coleman. And we've learnt a lot from Elliot and from people who were big fans of Elliot, like Joyce and Mike Plain, Joyce Wilkie and Mike Plain from All Sun Farm. Unfortunately, Mike has passed away now, but Joyce is still doing great things there. She introduced us to the work of Elliot Coleman originally, and Elliot, up in the northeast of the United States, has really he pioneered the techniques of growing all year round in a very cold climate in unheated greenhouses. Including these techniques with mobile polytunnels that can be moved from location to location to not have disease build up and the like. So Kirsten's put some great notes and links to those kind of articles and that information in our blog post. So if you haven't actually checked that out, I'd really recommend that you spend a bit of time looking at that. So back to the questions. What have we got here from Gigi? Gigi is keen for some tips on keeping a greenhouse within the ideal temperature range. Mine got down to -1 in central Victoria the other night, so below freezing. And also would love to hear you talk more about greenhouses attached to houses to heat the house. Okay, so a lightweight greenhouse that has got good ventilation is not going to be much warmer in the middle of the night. So this is a sort of key concept. Greenhouses basically increase the amount of heat in the daytime and do offer a bit of frost protection because of the fact that there is a little bit of stored heat in the thermal mass. But because they're lightweight structures, if you've got any kind of airflow through them, at night they will cool down to whatever the ambient temperature is. They can't actually, create much heat at night. So a passive greenhouse, which is the sort that we recommend because we don't want to be using a whole bunch of fossil fuel based energies to heat up a greenhouse, doesn't do a lot to raise the minimum temperatures. It does more to raise the maximum temperatures in the daytime. Now, there is a few things you can do, though, to reduce that freezing or increase the minimum temperatures. The main thing is to get thermal mass in there. So anything which is massive, it weighs a lot, that you can get into the greenhouse that can then warm up during the day, and at night, as it cools down, it will release its heat into that greenhouse. Now, especially if you shut the greenhouse down in the evening so that there's not so much airflow, and you've got some thermal mass in there, then that heat will have nowhere to go and it'll stay in the greenhouse. Now, larger, more complex greenhouses are sometimes double skinned in order to provide some insulation and keep the greenhouse warmer at night. But most simple greenhouses are on the single skin and they lose a lot of heat. So how can you get a whole bunch of thermal mass into your greenhouse? The easiest way I find, or we've tried and what we found worked, is to have large containers of water, particularly if they're like a black plastic container, maybe a secondhand olive drum or food grade plastic drum that's full of water. During the daytime, as the sun and the heat hits that black plastic container, it'll warm the water up there, maybe to 20 degrees Celsius, maybe even more. And then at night, that heat will be released slowly and keeping the minimum temperature a little bit higher. And that can help stop freezing. So that'd be my number one tip. As far as greenhouses attached to houses to heat the house, at Meliadora, we were there for 3 years, and it was an amazing addition to the studio that we were living in. The glass house made out of recycled Telstra phone boxes, actually. That greenhouse generated so much heat in the heat of, or the sunny winter days, that we could open the sliding door into our main living space and massive amounts of heat would come in there, and that will get stored in the thermal mass of the mud brick walls of the house to be released slowly in the evenings. We found that fantastic, and a really effective way of keeping our house more comfortable. It's also amazing to go and have a shower in a greenhouse surrounded by plants. So we found that really fantastic. It does require a fair bit of planning to make sure that you're not introducing a whole bunch of moisture into your house, and yeah, that you're protecting the footings of the house. So it's something that you need to spend a bit of time planning, and maybe get some help from some alternative building people. Some people have got a little bit of experience with that. So it's not a small undertaking, but can be an amazing addition, especially to a new build. Yeah. Sarah Hyde asked the question on Instagram, is mold an issue? How does the ventilation work? Yeah, great question. We've never really had too much of a problem with mold in greenhouses, although you can get some fungal diseases in there. Again, it comes down to airflow. So if you've got a 10 square metre greenhouse, 5 metres by 2 metres, you want to make sure that there's at least 2.5 square metres to approximately 5 square metres of openings that you can open up during the day to allow that ventilation through. That's if it's passive. You can put in more complicated fan systems, or you can even get these amazing little automatic, not electronic, just they work from the expansion of gas in a strut, like on the back of your hatchback car, that expand and open ventilation windows in the roof of your greenhouse or glass house when it gets hot, and then they close again at night. So anything like that, it needs to have some way of opening up. Otherwise, you're just going to find, even in the middle of winter, you can get extreme temperatures up over 40 degrees Celsius, which can destroy your plants, which is not a great outcome. But as far as mold, not too much of a problem as long as you've got that cross ventilation. So ventilation, usually we try to do that passively. If you've got a tall greenhouse, then the chimney effect of letting fresh air in at the bottom and venting hot air at the top works very well. But generally, opening the roof works better than just having walls that partially open or slatted windows that open. The best is always to open at the top to get a bit of chimney draft going on. Jimmy's got a question. They want to build a greenhouse, cheaply if possible, but we live in a really windy area and wonder whether many alternatives won't tolerate much wind. Maybe you've had some experience with wind at your location. So when we lived in the mountains in New South Wales, we were at 750 metres altitude on a very exposed site, and we definitely had to design our greenhouses so they would away. That meant that we had solid, heavy footings. We poured small concrete footings that had steel shafts embedded in them, so that this was very hard to lift out of the ground. Those steel shafts then had poly pipe, irrigation pipe, that went over them to form big hoops. Those hoops were then all joined together with metal beams, lightweight metal beams that went between the hoops to hold it all together quite rigidly with cross bracing in diagonals. Then we used a professional greenhouse skin over the top, which is quite thick, and we tensioned it down, pulled it down very, very tight and tensioned it at the end. You do not want to have any slack at all in that skin. If it's got slack, it will catch the wind and act like a sail, whereas if it's taut, then the wind will rush over the surface without catching it so much. And then it had, ropes over the top to. So you can definitely build a greenhouse which is very windproof, but we've seen plenty of situations where our friends and even professional market gardeners have had greenhouses blow away in extreme weather, and it's devastating, because not just the greenhouse but the crop underneath as well. So it's worth putting in the effort, but it definitely can be done. There's some tips on the website, including a whole rundown of how we built our polytunnel at Milkwood Farm all those years ago. Another question from Dania, which was the same: best greenhouses for exposed windy spots. Few about those. Uh, Someone NYS asks about converting an old concrete pool into a greenhouse. They live 200 kilometres south of Trish in Perth, and yeah, they would want to work out how to make a roof that might be viable in this climate. Well, an in-ground swimming pool, especially concrete, is an awesome choice because of the fact that it's got all that thermal mass, and because you don't need to build such a big structure over the top of it. It would be beautiful to do that out of recycled windows or recycled doors, but one of the challenges you're going to have is that going up and down into that swimming pool is going to be hard on you to move things in and out. So it might be a compromise to actually infill the swimming pool partially with soil and grow in soil in the swimming pool, and then have a low greenhouse over the top. That way you're not going so far down into it, but you're still using the structure for part of your height. So that might work. I think a lovely Aframe design could work really fantastically on that site. Someone called Ern Malley, which is a great pseudonym. I can't wait for this. My question is, are there particular greenhouse designs suited to or matching to a particular growing methods or types of plantings? What to build if you're growing herbs year-round for a business, or if you want to raise seedlings and keep some tropical plants? Well, this again depends very much on your location. Typically, if you're trying to grow commercially, then you see most people are going to go for a polytunnel in Australia, some sort of polytunnel structure, because you get a lot of area for a relatively low price. Whereas if you're just trying to raise a few seedlings for yourself, check out the links that we've got in the article on the blog about making mini greenhouses and cloches and cold frames. That they're much easier for that smaller scale growing. As far as trying to grow like plants, again, the main thing you need to watch out for there is the minimum temperatures, that they don't get too cold. Rather than when you're trying to grow vegetables, your goal is often to get the maximum temperatures up so that you are growing your heat-loving plants, like everything from the Solanaceae nightshade family, so your eggplants, your tomatoes, your capsicums, your chilies. Those things love the heat. You know, they're going to be growing fantastically at 30 degrees Celsius. So if you can get that heat in there in the shoulder seasons, you know, the late spring and the autumn, you're going to get fast growing plants that ripen quicker. So a classic unheated greenhouse or polytunnel will do that. It'll increase the daytime temperatures. But if you're trying to keep tropical plants happy and healthy, then that's where you see those beautiful traditional, like orangery from France, or the classic, you know, English glass house. Now, most of those had some kind of heat source, and that's usually means it's going to be very energy intensive. So my recommendation in those kind of scenarios where you're really trying to increase the minimum temperature is to look for some kind of more sustainable method in increasing that temperature. Thermal mass is the easiest one. Insulating the side of your greenhouse which faces towards the pole. So if you're in Australia, the south side of the greenhouse, or if you're in the United States, for example, it would be the north side of the greenhouse. We want to insulate that to stop that colder side from dropping temperatures too much. And then try to introduce some heat some way. So one method might be by building a great big compost heap inside the greenhouse. Compost gives off a huge amount of heat, especially as you're turning it. So if you've got the space, generating heat with compost is one way that we can heat it up. And another really nice technique is to have a system of underground pipes where warm air during the day is blowing through those pipes to heat up the ground under the greenhouse. And then part of that leaks back out, up through the soil back into the greenhouse, or it can actually have fans which turn on at the coldest part of the day to push air back through those ground pipes and move air that is heated by the earth back up into the greenhouse at the coldest part of the day. One of the pioneers of that kind of work is a guy called Darrell Frey, who wrote this amazing little book called The Bioshelter Market Garden. And in that, it's all about how to use greenhouses to increase the growing season. And with his designs, he's got all this thermal mass. I'm not sure if you can see in that diagram there, stone-sided garden beds. And he does a lot of that kind of work of passively heating the greenhouse by storing heat in the ground. Yeah. Anyway, we might just have time for maybe one more question. Maybe two. Shortacre Farm says that we've got heaps of secondhand hoops. So what next? Well, getting those hoops into the ground, anchoring them down really well with some kind of footings, cross bracing, and then putting a skin over the top. Yeah. And maybe last one. What to grow in greenhouses at what time of pest control, grasshoppers in greenhouses. Any recommendations on reading for greenhouse? So I've already given some recommendations of Katrina. So what to grow in greenhouses at what time of year? Again, really season extension of those plants which need that warmth to ripen. So anything that fruits. So your tomatoes, everything from that tomato family or the nightshade family. You know, you can do cucumbers. You can do sensitive herbs like basil and coriander, things that don't like, well, basil particularly doesn't like the cold. But really, you know, it's going to excel in things that fruit. You're not going to bother putting your cabbages in there normally, not in Tasmania. They're going to do fine outside. And you're not going to bother with things that are relatively slow, so your onions, your garlics, things like that. You're really going to focus on the things that are going to love that heat. So you could do climbing beans as one thing that grows in there, and lots of different herbs. As far as pest control, then there's a lot of detail on that. This is a huge subject we could go into for ages. But making sure that you know, your soil isn't too wet and the beds aren't too wet when the seedlings first go in, so you don't get, you know, a whole bunch of roly-poly beetles or slaters building up, and making sure that you've got a, you know, beautiful permaculture ecology happening in your greenhouse, with a range of different organisms. You know, having a little pond in there for wetland area for frogs, making sure that that even birds can come in and out, small birds can come in and out during the daytime when the vents are open, is a great way to ensure that we don't have explosions of a single organism. You know, things are going to get in there, so if they're going to get in there, you want to make sure that their predators can get in there too. And the more diversity that you have in there, the more of a stable habitat you'll have for the creatures which will start eating the herbivores as they start eating your crop. If you try to nuke it and you try to have it completely empty, the first thing that's going to explode in numbers are the herbivores that can eat your crop, because they have all the food that they need and no predators. So we want to make sure that there is a constant population of predators. In order to do that, we need a constant population of herbivores. So diversity is the key to make sure that everything keeps going. Be careful with a whole bunch of organic matter on the surface of your growing beds in a greenhouse environment. That can be a great breeding ground for particularly aphids. Other than that, make sure the ventilation's good, and you'll find that the diversity will keep everything in check, and you'll have great success. I think that's about all. We've gone for a bit over our time of half an hour. Thanks for all coming along. Make sure you check out that blog post that Kirsten put up on the website the other day. And if you've got any other questions, ask them at the bottom of that blog post, and we'll make sure that they get answered. We'll put this video up on there as well, and feel free to comment and share all you like. thanks for your time. Thanks for Kirsten and Heather in there in the background, looking after things. And we'll see you again next week. We're going to do these Facebook Lives every week. It was great to have you in here. And yeah, come along next week and tell your friends. See ya.